Hey guys, as you come in, feel free to test out the chat. Say hi, let me know that everything is working. Great. Okay, definitely activating closed caption. All right, let's get started.
Welcome to Science Fiction Writers Week. Before we get started, here's some important information about the week. During the week, you can chat with other participants, ask questions of speakers, share key wins and takeaways in our online community. To find the community, go to community.prowritingaid.com. You can find session times, session descriptions, and all replays on the Science Fiction Writers Week Hub. Navigate to a session and hit the drop-down arrow beside the title to access a replay. You can find the link to the Hub in the chat or in any of the emails we're sending throughout the week. Replays are available for everyone until September 9th. If you want continued replay access, you can upgrade to Pro Writing Academy for 50% off during Science Fiction Writers Week. In addition to the software integrations and editing suggestions available to free and premium users, the Academy tier includes access to live training intensives led by best-selling authors, hundreds of on-demand video workshops and exercises, and weekly accountability check-ins, among other things. Our first live training intensive begins September 5th and is led by Jessica Brody, the #1 best-selling author of Save the Cat Writes a Novel. This training intensive includes on-demand training as well as live sessions with Jessica every week. To learn more about Pro Writing Academy and access your 50% off discount, click the link in the chat. We're just about ready to get started. Remember to use the Q&A button to ask questions of our speaker during the session. Thank you for coming, and we hope you enjoy this session.
Hey everyone, so it's me again, Ash from Pro Writing Aid. We're at the end of day 2 of Sci-Fi Writers Week, and for our last session of today, we're joined by David Schultz. David is from Toronto and he writes speculative fiction and organizes the 1,000-member Toronto Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Group. Today, he'll be helping us to look at how the narrative lens is used in prose fiction with a very, very special focus on sci-fi. So over to you, David.
Thanks for the introduction, Ash, and the opportunity to talk about this very cool concept. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, the narrative lens. So for those of you who haven't heard of this before, I would say that this is one of the most important concepts in fiction writing. And you might be wondering if that's the case, why haven't I heard of this thing before? And it's because all writers sort of learn how to do this intuitively, but giving it a name allows us to talk about it directly and to use it as a conceptual tool to apply in particular cases. And we're going to look at some of those in a sci-fi context specifically. But since we're doing sci-fi, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about defining the genre. I think that we can't really solve this genre question. It's insoluble, but I just want you to know the way that I think about it. So basically, if we think about sci-fi and fantasy, the difference between them is largely aesthetic. They both fall under a broader category called speculative fiction. And essentially, they're defined by inventing something, a speculative element, some new thing in the world that the reader needs to learn about. The difference between hard and soft sci-fi is also a little flexible. It has fuzzy boundaries and people disagree about where they are. So the most important thing in all cases is to talk about the speculative element. How is this thing different from our world? In sci-fi, sometimes the term novum is used to refer specifically to the speculative element, but we can just use the broader term. When you're doing work with a speculative element, you're also doing world building. If you are inventing something new in your world, that has consequences, how it changes the economy, how it changes society, and you have to think through these things and somehow convey those to your reader. And you also have to think about the rules for how your new technology or science works. And all of those things are unique challenges when you're writing science fiction, for how you can gracefully do that without pulling the reader out of the story. So to talk about the narrative lens, I wanted to introduce it by looking at a common question that arises when people are thinking about writing. I see this all the time in, for example, Facebook writing groups, where people will ask a question in the form, how do you describe X? And so they'll say, how do I describe a werewolf? I'm writing a werewolf story, or a spaceship, or a battlefield. And the most common common form of this question is somebody will post a picture that they found of something that they want in their story. And they say, how do I describe this thing? And you'll get a lot of answers in the comments. And I would say 99% of those answers are wrong. Now you might say, David, isn't writing subjective? How can all of them be wrong? And I'm not saying that they're not well written. So they could be beautifully written, creative. They could use metaphors in an interesting way. They could have interesting imagery. So all of that stuff could be good, but they're still wrong because it's not possible to answer this question the way that it's posed. In the context of fiction, you can't describe anything in the abstract. You always have to describe through the point of view of the narrative lens. So thinking about a specific question, how do I describe a werewolf? Someone might ask such a question. And I would say, I don't know. Is your viewpoint character prey that's running away from the creature? Is your viewpoint character a werewolf hunter commissioned to protect a town? Or is your viewpoint character another werewolf searching for a mate? So before you know this information, you can't really describe something in the context of fiction. There is no description in the abstract. It's necessary to first define your narrative lens. And if you want a slogan for it, writers don't describe. They filter details through a narrative lens. So this is a little diagram for a way to think about what's happening here with the narrative lens. And this is fundamental to all of fiction. So you have all of these details in your mind that you might want to describe, the way the world works, what kind of a world it is, maybe the setting or something like that, or what people might experience, the sort of sensations they would have there. These are all the raw ideas on the left-hand side. And they are all filtered through your narrative lens. You need to figure out who your character is, what sort of things they care about, maybe what their level of language is. And by filtering those through, they become the text of the story. And this metaphor of a lens is not unique to fiction writing. So for example, we talk about seeing the world through rose-tinted glasses. We all understand that your psychology shapes the way that you see the world. And so it should be the same in your writing. Your character's psychology has to shape what ends up on the page. When we're thinking about what makes up the narrative lens, this is really all of the high-level structural things that you can think about when you're choosing words. And there's two broad categories of these. So there's those that are derived from the point of view character. So figure out who your point of view character is, what sort of things do they think about, what mood are they in, what are they trying to accomplish, all of those sort of things. And the second category is what sort of story you're trying to tell. So things like genre and tone, or if you want to build a theme or motif into your story. So obviously, if you're writing a comedy or a horror, your word choice might be different. But between the two of these, I would say the first category is much more important. That should be the one you're primarily focused on. Ideally, you want to do both at the same time. But if you're doing just the second one, then it could feel forced if you choose a word just because you think it helps develop a certain tone, even though it's not something that the character would necessarily think. I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between show, don't tell, because this is common writing advice that we've probably all heard. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds of show, don't tell, but I'll simplify it, at least the way I understand it, this way. What is told is the explicit referential content of a sentence, what it literally says. And what is shown is everything else that is conveyed by that, the subtext, anything that you can infer, anything that's implied, and so on. And what's the relationship to the narrative lens? Well, if you look at the text, whatever it says on the page is what is told. And what is shown is the narrative lens. All of the things that you have figured out in advance about how the words should be filtered through that lens, all of those details will be apparent by implication through the text. So you're showing what kind of a character it is by the way that you describe things. So for example, here's the werewolf question again in text form. So here's a little bit that I could read. Its hunched form lumbered across the tree line, snapping through dry brush. Now and then it stopped, thrusting its snout towards the moon to sniff furiously, searching for a scent. It was big, not the biggest Kadja had ever seen, but big enough to quicken her heart, to make her own breathing seem louder, to make her second guess the wind. She breathed in. The creature's musk was there like a wet dog. As long as she could smell it, it couldn't smell her. So we have some description here. We get a rough idea about what this thing looks like, but more important than that, we get an insight into the narrative lens that's shaping why these words are chosen the way that they are. So simple question, is this from the point of view of prey or hunter? Is it someone running away or tracking? We get this sense. How scared is the point of view character? So on a scale of, maybe terrified on the one hand to hesitant on the other. We get a rough sense of that, appropriate to the character that we're trying to convey. We get a sense of the experience of the point of view character. All of this without saying it directly, just based on the descriptive words that we used. And the last question here, is the point of view character a werewolf? So it's possible we're writing a story about a werewolf hunting another werewolf or something like that. So we can read this and try to discern, based on word choice, is this character a werewolf or not? And there's one word here that I think is fairly decisive in saying no. That's the word creature, for example. So why pick the word creature here? Well, creature has a sort of alienating effect. It's saying it's something other. If this was a fellow werewolf, we would have a different word here. To say werewolf or creature, both would be correct in describing what is actually happening in the writer's imagination, but we choose the word creature because of that specific alienating effect, and that is determined by our narrative lens. There's a little exercise here. We're not going to pause to do it during this presentation, just so that we can keep things moving along. But I'm going to go through the exercise, and if you want to do this while the presentation is going on, if there's time at the end, maybe we can take a look at some of these and go through them together. But this is just meant to practice deliberately, consciously using the narrative lens to shape description. It's meant to be very, very short, just 1 to 4 sentences. And we have the werewolf example there on the left, but we also have a spaceship example that we could try to do. So how might a spaceship look if it is a captain's first visit to the ship that they're taking command of? Or if it's an enemy spy on board a ship, what sort of things are they going to notice? How are they going to think differently about different elements? What are they going to attend to? Or a biologist, their first time in space, what sort of things are they noticing? How do they think about things? The goal of this exercise is to be able to convey the point of view through your choice of descriptive phrases without specifically stating or alluding to the point of view. It should be evident by the way that your character thinks about things, what sort of person they are and what is their position in relation to that. So the success criteria when we look at these is we should be able to read what you come up with and know which of those prompts you've chosen just by the way you've described things. So I'll move on to the next thing. Looking at some specific applications in science fiction. So we're going to look at a few. These are the different ones we're going to go through. For the first four are going to be science fiction related. The last one I wanted to talk about just because I think it's important. It's not specific to sci-fi. But the problems here are too many details. Where to start? This is a common problem that a lot of writers face, where they have these very vivid pictures in their mind about what things should look like, but there's just too much and they're not sure where they should go with it. We're also going to look at handling exposition, and we're going to look at handling skin tone, because a lot of people mess this up in ways that are problematic. And all of these potential issues can be addressed by thinking of it in terms of the narrative lens. Okay, so let's look at this too much detail one. So you have this richly developed world building in your notebook. You know the kind of world you want to build, but you don't know which details to include, in what order. Questions you might ask yourself are, how comprehensive should it be? Should I truncate it? Should I start with the big picture and move down to smaller details? Should I put the most interesting things first? And the solution, of course, here is to use the narrative lens, and in particular, psychological salience. It just means what experiences, what sensations are jumping out to your specific point of view character. So a simple example here would be an outhouse. It's a very visceral sensation, so it's easy to see what the problem is here if people do it wrong. So a character steps into an outhouse. Do we first mention the approximate dimensions of the outhouse, or do we mention the smell? I mean, there's a lot of details you could mention if you wanted to be comprehensive about it, but really something should be jumping out at your point of view character in this situation, and that's where you want to go to first. Stick to what your character would actually feel and experience. That is the deciding. That's how you decide where you want to go with your description. Let's talk about exposition, and this is a unique problem to science fiction, because we have the extra task, apart from other fiction writers, of introducing entirely new invented worlds to our readers, and things work differently and the facts are different. Sometimes there's different physics, and somehow we need to get all of this across. And if we don't do it in the right way, it feels very clunky. So if you force your exposition, the reader will know what you're doing intuitively, and it'll pull them out of the story. If you don't put enough of it there, it could lead to confusion. And if there's too much of it, it could also lead to boredom. So how do we handle this? So here's a quote on the subject from Orson Scott Card in Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction. And he says, you have to keep it in balance. Information must be trickled into a story, always just enough to know what's happening. And I think probably there's some truth to this, but it seems like this is a skill. To keep things in balance is something that it doesn't really help. It's something that you have to intuitively learn. It's kind of a truism that you have to keep things in balance. You could say this about any element of writing. Too much of anything is bad, and not enough is bad as well. So it doesn't really give us a way to do that balance. I also think it's not really a question of how much exposition you're doing when you're talking about whether exposition is clunky or not, because a single sentence could feel clunky if it's out of place. So to give an example here, Gerald aimed his Peacekeeper 2000 plasma rifle at the intruder. Okay, that's fine, I guess. The PK-2K was equipped with biometric fingerprinting to ensure that the trusted weapon did not fall into enemy hands. Very clunky. Why is that there? This is exposition that jumps out. It's not handled well because there's no reason why our point of view character would be thinking such a thing at this moment. So it's not really a question of how much, it's a question of whether you're gracefully integrating it into the narrative. So we could do some work to fix this by adding a little bit of detail about why our protagonist is thinking about this thing right now. Just 2 feet away, there was a risk he'd try to grab it. Okay, so because the guy is so close, now our protagonist is thinking about the defense mechanism on his weapon. So we've given a plot related reason why this thought will occur. We can call this thing a triggering thought. So something happens in the immediate environment that triggers this narrative. Now, there's another problem that we've just created. This sentence here is very clunky because this last part, you'll notice, is not needed. But so if we look here, just 2 feet away, there was a risk he'd try to grab it, but the PK2K was equipped with biometric fingerprinting. We can stop there. Everything beyond there to ensure that the trusted weapon did not fall into enemy hands, that's implied by the mentioning of this feature in the context of the fear that the weapon would be grabbed. So we can just cut it off like that. So this is a strategy of implication. If you can cut that stuff off, then cut it off. And finally, we can talk about abeyance. So this is very useful here in a science fiction context. So just 2 feet away, there was a risk he'd try to grab it, but the PK2K was equipped with a soul core. What the heck is a soul core? I don't know. The reader doesn't know what it is right now. They can sort of figure out from the context that it has something to do with not letting other people use the weapon. But we can hold off on explaining that. We don't need to provide exposition here. We know enough that the scene can continue as it is. And there's kind of an implicit promise that we might find out later on what exactly a soul core is or other ways that it might operate. So this is the strategy of abeyance, where you sort of mention something just enough to keep things moving along. And we can do that with neologisms like soul core, where it conveys something to the reader so they can kind of roughly figure out what it means, but go along with it. I think this is actually a normal part of reading. When we're reading in a normal case, even outside of science fiction, we will encounter words that we don't know what they mean. We sort of kind of figure out what they mean in context and we just go on with it. And you could just use that same general principle when you're inventing words to move your science fiction story along. I've included this as an example of effective handling of exposition, The Martian by Andy Weir. So what's notable about this book is that there is a ton of science, math, and engineering. So you might say, well, this book is very, very dense with exposition, a lot of sciencey stuff and math stuff, but it does not feel like clunky exposition at all. All of it makes sense. So the question is why? What strategy was used here to make sure that all of that exposition works? And the strategy is a narrative lens where all of that science and math and engineering makes sense. So Andy Weir chose a character and put them in a situation where they would naturally be thinking about all of those things. So none of it needs to be forced. So this is a matter of engineering your character and your plot so that just by following the narrative lens, all of the exposition falls out of that naturally. Okay, so this is the non-science fiction application that I mentioned. So and then it's an important application of the narrative lens, I think, because this is something that people get wrong a lot of the time and often unintentionally. So when you're handling skin tone and race, you can make mistakes that actually cause social harm that inadvertently appear racist and that are taken the wrong way through no bad intention on the part of the author. So this is where you really want to be careful and get your craft right. And I will show you an example of how, in my opinion, to do this wrong, unequivocally wrong. And I've seen, I grabbed these by searching for how to describe skin tone. And some people have lists like this. And I would say that please don't do this. In my personal opinion, this is a recipe for doing things very, very wrong. Some people might think, well, am I not just being objective by picking a word that matches a color on a color palette and using that word? Well, not really, because that's also written from a point of view. You can't avoid writing from a point of view. And if you do it this way, you're going to run into problems. How to actually handle writing skin tone by looking through the narrative lens. What I think people should think about is that anything that you write in your description, you are saying that that's how your character views the world. So you have to be deliberate about the point of view that you're impliedly creating through the description that you're using. So an example of doing this well, I think, there's many ways to do this well, but this is one example from Colson Whitehead, a zombie novel where you don't actually figure out that the protagonist is Black until, I don't know, 5/6 of the way through the novel. It just doesn't come up. They're not looking at themselves in the mirror and describing their skin tone, which would be a very wrong way to do this. It's just not something that they're thinking about when they're looking at other people or when they're thinking about themselves. The issue of skin doesn't come up. Now, somebody might say, and I think they would be wrong to say this, I was imagining them as a white person, and that disrupted my understanding of the novel. So you should have told me earlier. But I think if a reader thinks that, the error in that case is on the reader. The writer has done their job. And the writer in this case was actually doing something very intentional, I think. They're telling us that the character is not thinking about race. Now, that might just be saying something about the character who doesn't see race when they're running around, but it also might be saying something about the construction of race, in particular, when society is falling apart because of a zombie apocalypse. So it's implicitly saying, look, when society falls apart in this way, who's thinking about the construction of race anymore? That's just not on anyone's mind. So this is a very deliberate use of how characters are thinking about things in the domain of race. So let's overview all the stuff that we looked at. So the narrative lens, big picture, that's all the high-level structural considerations that are determining all of your word choices. You could say that this is like an advanced point of view. Usually when point of view is taught, we're taught about pronoun choice and tense. So we talk about, second person future tense or whatever. But when we're talking about the narrative lens, this is the point of view, but it influences every single word that you pick. What is the narrative lens built from? Well, primarily from the point of view character. What sort of person are they? What sort of things do they think about? What mood are they in? What are they trying to accomplish? And so on. And secondarily, from the broader narrative aims with your story. So what sort of story are you trying to tell? Are you trying to build in a theme or a motif? What genre, what tone are you going for? Do you need to do some foreshadowing? Do you need to make some word choices specifically to set something up for later? Although I will say, try to do both at the same time, and try not to do the second one just on its own, because the reader sometimes can sense when you're doing that. If a word doesn't seem like it's compelled by the point of view character, then it can easily feel like the author has injected it there with an agenda. Whereas if it comes from the character itself, it will feel natural. And then the specific applications that we looked at, there's psychological salience. So when you're building a scene, focus on what matters to your character, what's sticking out to them for whatever reason. For handling exposition, if you want to insert some exposition, it should flow naturally from what's happening. So things in the environment have to cause the character to think about something. Even if it's just one sentence, if there isn't something happening around the character that makes them think about a certain fact, then it will feel forced. So exposition can be clunky and fail, even if it's just one sentence. So it's not really a matter of the density of the exposition. In fact, to use The Martian as an example, the exposition there is very, very dense. There's a lot of science, math, engineering stuff, but it all feels very natural because it fits with what's happening and the sort of character that we're looking at the world through. Abeyance, basically holding off on explanations. You don't need to give all the exposition right away. The character knows, in the example that I gave, the character knows what a soul core is. So the character can just glide past it. Yeah, the gun has a soul core. Okay, that's fine. It feels natural at that point. Now, if you stopped and explained what a soul core was, that could feel like clunky exposition. You don't need to do that, though. You can hold off, and the reader will know that the necessary explanation will come later. They can figure out at that time the implications of the soul core for what's happening at that moment. And then similarly, implication, cut off what you don't need. Just have what's there for the sake of the character moving through the plot in a way that feels natural to them. And then the last thing we looked at was handling skin tone. And I would say here to always default to the narrative lens. Anytime you describe anything, you are saying something about how the character views the world. So if you're fixating on race, then you're saying something about your character fixating on race or noticing race, which is, I should add, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to be very careful with it. Okay, I would like to have some interactivity and talk about any of these things, and also maybe look at some examples that people came up with for that exercise earlier. But for the questions in particular, I'm very interested in anything that was not clear, but also anything that I said that you thought was contentious or maybe dubious, because any space where we can have a little disagreement and discussion on that disagreement is precisely the area where we're going to get that more nuanced understanding that's more useful for applying things in practice. And Ash, do you think I should just go through these in order? And do you think I should turn off the screen at this point for the Q&A?
Sure. That's fine. It's absolutely fine.
Hmm.
You can take them in order, or yeah, you can take them in order, and then I'll just,
Sure. Yeah. So, and should I read the questions out, or should I invite our participants to ask their questions verbally?
Oh no, definitely read them out and then just answer as you go.
Sure. Okay. So, Leah Rebecca Bruda has a question. Opinion on having a glossary at the end of the book, explaining stuff like technology or cultures, backgrounds that would have been dreadful in the book to read, or small footnote explanations. Yeah, I've heard of these things also for pronunciation guides. If your book has a lot of strange pronunciations, it would be very, very clunky to include pronunciations in line with the text. So sometimes people include description guides. I think Watership Down is an interesting example here. This is a fantasy story, of course. I mean, we're talking about rabbits, but really it's a fantasy story and an adventure story. But there's footnotes in that story. So as you're going along, you're learning about rabbit culture from the point of view of a broader narrator. So definitely you can do this. I think the main thing to think about is the fact that as soon as you include such a thing, you're immediately implying the existence of a narrator or storyteller that's broader than the point of views that you've embodied in the book. So I think these things are much more common to see if you're going to be using an omniscient voice, because then having footnotes or endnotes or anything like that doesn't feel as much of an addition. It sort of fits with it naturally because you already have this authoritative voice who's sitting outside of the story. But if you're telling things from a third person limited point of view, the narrator is sort of tied to the point of view. So when you add the footnotes, you're adding that additional voice outside of it. So I wouldn't say that you should or shouldn't do it. I would just say to be aware of the fact that there is an additional level of narration being added when you include such a thing. Nicole Whistler was asking about the question of avoiding racism. Yeah, so, okay, to continue reading the comment. You're saying to avoid words like sepia, khaki, etc., and to keep a tight point of view. Are you saying to avoid mentioning skin color altogether in most cases? No, but when this is done wrong, it's done because people are fixating on race in a way that does not naturally flow from the character. So to give a simple example, if you're writing a book where all the characters are white, like you're writing, I don't know, in some small European city that doesn't have many Black people, and somebody sees their first Black person, or if you're writing somewhere, an African village that a white visitor comes, in those cases, it would be perfectly natural to notice race. And I don't think that there's any implication of racism in noticing race in a situation like that. And the way that people think about race the way that they describe it is going to come from their own psychology. If you have a clearly defined character, and if you know what sort of character they're supposed to be and the way they think about the world, you can default to making the description come naturally from the way they think about the world. The problem comes when it's forced, when it doesn't seem like it's coming from the character, when it's actually coming from the author. Yeah, it has to come naturally from their point of view. Now, it is also possible to write a story about a deliberately racist character who notices race in negative ways. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. You just need to be aware of what you're doing. And the craft thing that people get wrong here is the author deliberately fixating on race in a way that doesn't come naturally from the characters. This is an interesting question here too about how does narrative lens work within the context of omniscient voice? So I was wondering whether I wanted to address this in the presentation notes. So I guess I'm glad that it came up because the narrative lens is a lot easier to think about, simpler to think about when you're doing a focalized point of view. You can do it in an omniscient point of view, of course, but it's a little more complicated, as omniscient is actually generally a little bit more complicated because omniscient, as you know, slides from one point of view to another. So just doing that slide alone is difficult, but when you slide into another character's point of view, then your description can subtly take on the way that that character sees things. However, there is generally a broader authorial voice when you're using omniscient. So there's an extra step that you need to do in making sure that your authorial voice is well defined. So just, you could think about it this way. When you're writing an omniscient, there is a narrator that's floating above the action. And your narrator does think about certain things, and they do focus on certain things, and they have certain concerns. If your narrator, for example, is like a sort of a historical narrator, you're going to focus on sort of historical facts, but you're sort of defining your narrator in a more of an abstract way in that case. Broadly speaking, I think one of the reasons that omniscient fell out of favor is because you need to not only be able to handle the individual point of view well, you also need to be able to slide between different point of views and handle all of them well. And you also need to be able to handle this broader authorial voice well. So doing all of that just makes it a lot more tricky. I think it's probably better to write in third limited for a while before you start writing in omniscient if you want to. Plus there's the matter of omniscient not really being very prevalent today. So it's a harder sell. But yes, the narrative lens still works there. How do you determine the narrative lens? Is narrative lens the same as which character the story is told through? Yeah, for the first part of it, roughly speaking, so when I think about this stuff, I usually think about it either in a first person point of view or in a third person limited point of view. But in both cases, the language that you're using in your narration is determined by the way that your point of view character thinks. So those are the glasses through which the world is shaped, whether they're rose tinted or otherwise. I think it maybe is easier to see that in first person, which is possibly why first person some people find easier to write, because you sort of get that for free. You understand you're writing from somebody's point of view, so you understand intuitively that everything that you write has to be filtered through the way they would talk about things. It's less obvious to see this when you're using third person limited, but the same principle applies. Your narrator has to be colored by the way that your point of view character sees things. This is what it means to write in third person limited. What's the view on the narrator describing characters, or the point of view characters thinking about other characters based on real world actors and actresses as a way of avoiding skin color? So you might say, well, I don't want to handle this discussing skin color directly. I feel like I might mishandle this or write something that I shouldn't, or do something unintentional. So I'm just going to compare them to actors and actresses as a workaround. I suppose you could do this, but I would say again, like, is that the way that your point of view character thinks? Because we're saying something about the character whenever we make a description to a celebrity. So we're saying something about who their points of comparison are. If they're always comparing other people to celebrities, evidently this is a character who thinks about celebrities a lot. So we're not just describing characters when we use a technique like that, we're also describing the way that our point of view character thinks about the world. So it could be appropriate or not. It would depend on your point of view character. Somebody asked, what would you recommend if you're writing a screenplay instead of a book or a story? I think I should probably avoid this question because I don't have too much experience with writing screenplays. But I do know that the description here, it should be pretty much to the point. It needs to be something that the people reading it don't really need to understand. So the advice of show, don't tell in the normal sense of writing fiction doesn't really apply here. You just write in a matter of fact way what needs to happen. But I think it's a more complicated thing that I wouldn't want to jump into. So my protagonist is on another world with humanoid characters. Okay. Skin complexions, not of any race or ethnic background. So alien skin complexions, alien physiology. How would you, so the question is, how would you describe it? Yeah, it's an interesting problem. So, I mean, there's one key question here, which I'm not 100% sure on based on the way this is asked. But if your protagonist is a human who has happened to land on that world, that gives you an easy way to start describing those things, because a human dropped in an alien world is going to start noticing certain things about the way that people look or the aliens look. However, it would be very unnatural if your character was born on this world of the aliens to dwell on the physical traits, in particular the physical traits that distinguish them from humans. It's very obvious if you do such a thing that you're doing it for the benefit of the reader and not because it makes sense given the psychology of the character. Typically, I mean, a typical strategy for this is you give small little evocative details. For example, like humans do things like they brush their hair, or they move their hair out of from in front of their eyes, stuff like that. Your aliens can do things like that too, but not with hair, right? So they push down their quills or something, right? So little details like that to subtly imply these physiological differences, I think might be the way to do it. I think in the aggregate, you're going to have to use a lot of these different techniques if your aliens are very different, and it's going to be a challenge to make it come across naturally if your protagonist is also alien, because they wouldn't have a natural reason to fixate on those things. You're going to have to find little techniques here and there for letting those details through. I suppose another technique you could do, so you could invent those things like little physical habits that are comparable to human habits, but suggest different physiology. You could also do, if they find an object or something, they could comment on how it looks like they find an object, a certain green object, so it's like green like the color of mom's skin or something like that. So you could do little tricks like that too, I suppose. Books or online resources to focus on narrative lens. Yeah, I wish I remembered where I first learned about narrative lens from. It might have been The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. It might have been Damon Knight's book, Creating Short Fiction. But those are good books anyway. I mean, those are in my top 10 writing craft books for sure. So worth checking out. But yeah, I don't know exactly where the best place to go for narrative lens would be. When choosing your narrative lens, how do you decide which one best suits the story? How do you know when you've chosen the wrong lens for the story? Yeah, this is a very tricky question. So, if you look at a very successful example, like the one I mentioned, The Martian, Andy Weir's book, he knew what kind of story he wanted to tell. He had a question for himself, which was, how hard would it be to survive on Mars? Could we do this? What are the problems? What obstacles will I face? And he created the perfect character and situation to make that happen. So I suppose if you start from that point of view, you could design a character that will be at the heart of the issue that you want to explore. Another way to do it is if you have a speculative premise, you've invented some sort of weird world, like, I don't know, a world where karma is real because robots enforce it with artificial intelligence or something. Okay, that's idea, but it's not a story. How do we make it a story? Pick somebody who will be at the heart of something going wrong. Who is going to be the character who is most closely related to things messing up with this system? Is it like an engineer who notices that there's a problem? Is it somebody who faces an injustice? I don't know. But that's another way to think about design a character that will suit the needs of your story well. Yeah, that's another way. So, but somebody else was mentioning another strategy you could use for who to pick for your character. So the strategy that I just spoke about is if you start from a speculative premise, where do you go from there? So how do you pick the character? Well, the character that's at the heart of that thing going wrong. But what if you have like a complex scenario, lots of different characters, you know the plot, you know what sort of needs to happen, but you don't know whose point of view you should follow. And the rule that somebody mentioned in the comments there was take the person who goes through the most change. I think that's a generally good rule. And you might also think, take the person who has to make the most significant choice. And you might find that those are often the same character because characters reveal change not through what they say, but through the choices they make. So broadly speaking, an arc is when at the start of the story, they do one thing, they make one choice, and at the end of the story, they make another choice that is different. That shows change. So if you choose the character that is either making the biggest choices or the character that is changing the most, that might turn out to be the same person, and that's probably the direction you should go in. Somebody was asking about the books. Yes, the books that I mentioned were Creating Short Fiction by Damon Knight and The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. I very much like those two books. So somebody says that a beta reader told them that when they don't describe skin tone, then the reader believes that all the characters are white. Is that true? I purposely didn't describe skin tone in my manuscript. I would say it is not true. It might be true for some readers, but in that case, assuming you've stayed true to the story you want to tell and you've stayed true to the way that your character would see it, if a reader reads it that way, I would say the fault lies with the reader, not with the writer. So I'm just looking at the questions now. It's an interesting question about changing norms about language usage. So words evolve in meaning. What is not considered offensive a few years ago might change. Is it appropriate for authors to go back and alter terms? Yeah, I think so. Now you might want to have like a original edition just for historical purposes, but the author's job is conveying what they want to, they have a vision, they want to convey certain things to the audience, and if there's a shift in language, then they will find that they're no longer conveying what they wanted to. So I think it's appropriate in that case to make a change. I suppose there's something to be said for keeping things authentic and preserving history, but you could have that as a separate edition. I do think it makes sense to that if an author wants to fix problems that have arisen because of changes in language usage, that they should feel free to do that. Okay, here's a question on thoughts on when exposition should break from the narrative lens for the sake of expediency. So is there ever a point where engineering the circumstances for it to make sense through the point of view is more laborious than simply explaining it? It's an interesting question. So you might find there's some information, you might think there's some information that I really want the reader to know. And I'm really not sure how I can make a character think about this thing. Now it's hard to diagnose this particular problem without looking at a certain case. So these things often are different depending on the kind of story you want to tell and sort of information you want to reveal. But broadly speaking, I would say if the information is plot relevant, then it will naturally come up at some point when it needs to. If for no other reason, then the character, by virtue of the fact that it's plot relevant, is going to care about what's happening. So they're going to think about it. They're going to have some thoughts about it because it impacts their life in some way. That's true by definition because it's plot relevant. Now, if no point comes up in your novel where your character thinks about it, then you have to start wondering, is it plot relevant? Do I really need this? So that's how I think about that question broadly. But certainly there might be some cases in individual instances where it becomes a problem, where you want it, for example, you want some detail to come up sooner than it does or something like that. So those things can happen, but I don't think it's possible to have a general approach to that without seeing a specific case. Narrative distance. This is an interesting question. So is narrative, what is the relationship between narrative distance as a concept here in the craft of fiction and the narrative lens? So there is a relationship here. So narrative distance is basically how far above the head of your character are you telling the story from? And you can fluctuate as you're writing. Some passages might be at a remove, and some passages might be very close. Now, an example of very close would be just stream of consciousness writing, where you would have something like the raw, unfiltered thoughts. The narrator sort of disappears in that case. You're just getting pure thoughts from the character. That's the very closest you can get for narrative distance. But you can get the objective point of view. That's just stating facts that are happening outside of the character. And you can slide somewhere in between and have thoughts that are mediated by a narrator. The closer you are to the tighter your narrative distance is, the more that the narrative lens is going to shape the words that come out. Broadly speaking, that's the relationship. If your whole story is told entirely outside of the head of the character, you're basically talking about an omniscient narrator now, and your narrator could have a completely separate voice from the characters that they're following. But nowadays, most stories are told in a focalized point of view, so the narrative voice blends with the thought patterns of the point of view character. So on the question of mentioning skin tone, what if you want to ensure that the readers see a person of color not in an unusual place? So let's say we're talking about a society that is very multicultural and diverse, but the issue of race may no longer be the same or overcome. Okay, so in this case, so the first go-to example here is Zone 1 that I mentioned. So this is a society in which race has effectively been overcome because people are concerned about other things, namely the destruction of society by zombies. So the way the author handles it is just to not write it. Now you ask, well, what if you want to ensure that your readers see a person of color? You want to make a point of identifying the race or the skin tone of the people. So here is where you might potentially run into problems, because if your authorial intention is that the reader knows this, that might feel imposed, and you might inadvertently be focusing on race in a way that feels out of place. The answer here has to be that it has to come from the character. The character, for some reason, has to notice that or be thinking about it. I'll just make a quick note here. I'm happy to stick around a bit later to talk some more about some of these questions and answer more of these. And I welcome anyone to stick around for that. And also, I would like Ash to be able to say a few words before we finish. But so I hope everyone's okay if we just go a little bit overboard or over time to answer some of these questions.
No problem, David. I think we can stick around for like the next 15 minutes, if you'd like.
Cool. Okay, that sounds good. Thanks. So what would you suggest if your story has a diverse colony on a planet? The character probably wouldn't think about race in that case because they're used to it. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I wonder, so if we think about a comparable example, I mean, we could think about Star Trek or Star Wars here as touchstones, where they are showing very diverse communities But I don't think it's the case that the characters who occupy this world do not think about race. I think it's actually something that they quite notice. So in fact, you could say that there's some degree of racism and prejudice in these worlds too, for the way they classify other races. So I wouldn't say that that's necessary. Those are necessarily examples of diverse colonies that have overcome racism, but diverse worlds that are still dealing with it. Yeah, there's a few people mentioning about the implicit assumption by some readers that if you're not specifying race, then people might misread it, and then you have problems with representation. So we definitely want to have representation of diverse points of view and diverse characters. I think in practice, if you're writing a character from a traditionally marginalized perspective, and in particular, if you're writing a story where that marginalization in some way impacts the story, then you don't need to draw attention to, you don't need to pay too much effort to doing it intentionally, because it's going to naturally arise in the course of the story, just on the way you're writing. I'd also suggest that I think when this is done wrong, it's most often done wrong by white writers who are trying to include non-white side characters and clunkily handling it. I think it's less of a problem when people from marginalized communities are writing from that perspective. Is there a way to avoid over-exposition if my characters are introduced into completely new environments? They'd probably notice a lot through their narrative lens. Yes. Okay, so we can think about this in terms of your broad strategy. So we want to introduce the reader to this strange new world. And there's two ways to think. There's actually four ways to think about it. Let's look at these two. You can send your character through a portal, broadly speaking. So this is fantasy, or portal fantasy, it's called. Or you can immerse the reader. It's called immersion fantasy. But the difference being, if you want to situate the reader in a familiar environment, you start from a normal human perspective, and then you send them through a portal into a magical world or to an alien world. And now you can view everything from the point of view of a human encountering these things. Whereas in immersion fantasy, you start in a fantasy world, or you start in a science fiction world, in which case it becomes very, very difficult to handle the exposition in a way that is as straightforward, I guess you could say. These are generally more challenging because you're dumping the reader into the deep end and expecting them to swim there. That's why children's books are often written as portal fantasies. So like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, or Alice in Wonderland. You start with a normal character and then you send them through a portal. And this allows the child reader in that case to have a familiar context by which to understand and view the strange new world they're in. I don't think it leads to too much exposition. I think it leads to the right amount of exposition because they're going to notice the things that matter to them in that moment and that are going to be driving the story forward. Probably, if you get dumped on an alien world, you're not going to dwell on the, very, very minor details of, the veins on a leaf or something like that. There's a lot of stuff you could invent that your point of view character is just going to ignore. They're going to focus on the tiger that's chasing them, or alien tiger, or whatever it is, right? So that that automatically narrows it down to what you need to focus on. Does the narrative lens affect the way you describe abstract things like clothing, furniture, building, etc.? Yes, it affects absolutely everything. Like a simple example here, wish I remember where this came from, but if talk about somebody hanging out in a lounge and they're smoking. Now, is the cigar smoke, is it coiled around her neck or is it draped around her shoulders? Okay, we're talking about the same scene here, the same physical details, but the way that it is described is fundamentally shaped by the kind of story we're trying to tell. If we want to have some foreshadowing, or if we want to have some nefarious edge to it, or the elegance of draping. So these broader structural considerations shape your word choice across the board, every word that you choose. So someone asked a little bit more explanation about abeyance. So it just means you give the reader a little bit to hold on to, and then you just hold off on it, just enough for them to grab onto it. So the example that I use here was, oh, his plasma rifle had a soul core. Okay, what's that? I mean, I know something interesting has happened there. I know it has this special feature, but you hold off on it. And that does not turn the reader off the book. They don't need to know everything. They know that there's something interesting going on there, and they're willing to wait to find out, as long as the action is moving forward. You just need to give enough so that what the character is doing makes sense to the reader. So if we understand in this context that he's about to have some sort of a gunfight or confrontation or something like that, we know the stakes. So we know enough to have the tension to move the scene forward. We don't need to be told at that moment what a soul core is exactly. The transference of concepts of racism to species. This has been a common trend throughout a lot of science fiction, right? Using alien races as allegories for racism. You could certainly do this, but a lot of that older sci-fi now seems very clunky because they're in terms of their social progress was so far behind relative to us in terms of equality that the lessons that they're trying to impart are just common sense. So it seems needless and can even come across as racist because it's dwelling on something that is so obvious to us now. Cool. I would like to say thank you to everyone for coming. I think this is a very cool concept, and I'm glad that there's so many people coming out in such a vibrant discussion, lots of questions. I'm going to pass it over to Ash, but if any of you want to reach out to me through my website, you could do that. But thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ash, for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, David. That was really a great presentation. And thank you so much for sticking around a bit longer, and also to you wonderful participants. Thank you as well. I'll be dropping a few links as well as David's website, so you guys can visit that. No worries about the persons who had to jump off earlier. Of course, the replays will always be on, well, not always, but will be on the hub along with the other sessions that we've had today and yesterday. So thanks again, guys. Thanks, David. Looking forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. All right. Bye, everybody.